One, two, three. Hey everybody, welcome back to Chalkboard History, Volume 2, Episode 7, 8, 9, something like that. So over the last few episodes, we've been, I've been talking to various members of the staff. So today we have with us Jay Willis, who usually is behind the camera. And today he's joining us to talk about something that is fun for everybody. The Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, that's a way to put it.
So I thought it would be interesting to have Jay come in because you're really one of the staff members that I especially when it came to Ripavilla, talking about how to incorporate some things that I've learned as I've been working on my new book about the Klan and just trying to incorporate it into the tour in an accurate, in a professional way, but getting people to understand. I think maybe two main points to talk about today. Why did the Ku Klux Klan start in Tennessee? Which had always puzzled me because, Tennessee is not Mississippi and South Carolina. So why did it start here? In fact, right around here, just to the south. And then what was really going on and the why? So I think I guess the natural place to start is really that the war ends. And I told you that one of the things I learned right away is in Tennessee, the state legislature is called the General Assembly. So right after the war, they passed what they called a franchise law, and it disenfranchised white men who had any connection to the Confederacy or could not prove their loyalty. Well, this cuts out a substantial section of the white population. I mean, I think probably 3/4 of the white men in Tennessee couldn't vote. And interestingly, they accept that reasonably well. I think that there was a sense of I don't know whether it's honesty or honor. They understood they'd lost the war, and a consequence of that was they couldn't vote. Plus, they also thought everybody in Nashville were a bunch of radicals anyways, because Brownlow's administration wasn't well liked. So that's the first step. But then tell everybody what happens next, which really spawns the Klan.
Well, it certainly wasn't Brownlow or anything like that. It was the 15th Amendment being passed. It was African American men now gaining the right to vote in the United States of America. It wasn't anyone getting the right to vote taken away from them. It was having the right to vote be given to a certain group of people. And that's really where we see the formation of the KKK.
All right, hold on. We got to stop. Because it's actually not the 15th Amendment.
You wouldn't say that was the 15th Amendment?
No, because that's not till 1870. What happens is the legislature gives black men the right to vote in Tennessee.
In 1867?
Yeah, but that's
I
not
thought that was the 15th Amendment.
No.
Okay.
No.
That was a state law?
That's a state law because the states run the elections. The 15th Amendment isn't until way later on.
Oh, okay. That was something that I was confused about.
Yeah, in fact, the general. So we can.
Yeah, we got
So we'll back up and edit that so we don't have to start from the beginning. But because the 14th Amendment hasn't even been ratified by the time the legislature passed the second franchise law. So let's back up. So I'm going to turn it over to you and say, so what was the thing that happened in 1867 that really sparks this resistance?
Well, it was definitely African American men now gaining the right to vote, specifically in the state of Tennessee, where now former Confederates did not have the right to vote. That is really the spark that we see in Tennessee, where the KKK, they decided it needed to be founded.
So it's really like a double, two sides of a sword, double blade. It's that white men have been disenfranchised, and now black men are enfranchised. And what I learned, when I read the legislature's passing of the second franchise law, I started looking through newspapers. And one of the great things today is you can get a variety of websites like newspapers.com, and you start hitting on keywords. Within weeks, you started to see mentions of Ku Klux, Ku Klux, masked men, and it's almost all like in Giles County, but there's some in Murray County. And it's amazing how quickly it spread. I did not understand the depth of the the fury that emerges in 67. So what does the Klan do? Because before we started this, we were talking about, there's so many myths about the Klan. One group always wants to distance themselves. Well, they're not that bad. And then the other side is saying, well, they were murdering and killing and lynching people everywhere. What's really happening in 67?
Well, I would say that they don't need to murder anybody. Their main thing is intimidation. It's guarding ballot boxes. It's, beating up teachers at Freeman's Bureau schools. It's making sure that people were intimidated and they would just essentially go back to the same position that they had been in before the Civil War had started.
So you mentioned Freedmen's Bureau School. So who's the guy that's running the Freedmen's Bureau School here in Spring Hill?
Henry Eddy.
Right.
Yeah. And he gets run out of town pretty quickly after the Civil War. He gets threatened, he gets beaten up, and that's not something that's only happening in Spring Hill. That's happening all throughout the southern United States.
Yeah, I mean it's a few years. He actually does stand up, but eventually he does leave. It's amazing to look at the Freedmen's Bureau records, and I've made a point of now saying this in a number of talks that I've given. Eddy and others were reporting how Klan members, armed to the teeth, would often sit within sight of the school. Mm-hmm. So they didn't have to actually hurt anybody because they're watching not only the children, they're watching the children's parents, and obviously they're watching Eddy and his wife and their kids. That's the sort of thing that was happening right here in Spring Hill, literally within a mile or two of where we're sitting. Mm-hmm. And then I think about, what did the Chairs family know? Or what did people like the McGavics or anybody around here? And I am absolutely convinced that these people, if they didn't know anybody who was in it, they certainly knew what was going on. Because it's not like this was a secret around the area. I encourage anyone, you want to read newspapers, it's wild what is happening, especially in 67. But I think 1868 is the worst year. That's actually the year the Klan busts a guy out of a jail, black guy, busts him out of a jail, dragged him down Lewisburg Pike, hanged him and shot him. So everybody around the area knew about that.
Yeah. And that was at the circle in Franklin. That was at the square, correct?
Well, that's where they got him, and then they took him out of town.
And that's just up the road where the Carters and the McGavics live, and of course the Chairs are in this big house here in Spring Hill, and Henry Eddy's getting basically run out of town and beaten up.
Well, I know years ago when I first heard the stories, I heard stories about the Klan, but then sometimes it would, and it was usually from a guest, on a tour or something, and it would, not that I was even talking about the Klan, but there was always something about it that came up, and the story that I heard consistently was how the Klan wasn't really that bad, and they only formed to resist carpetbaggers, Yankees, Negroes. I mean, it was all these sort of punchline words. And I've learned that, no, actually, that's not what the Klan was doing at all. They were targeting people with specific intent. Mm-hmm. And I learned also that, there's six guys, right?
Yeah, Immortal Six, yeah.
And several of them are members of the 3rd Tennessee, which was Nat Chairs' regiment.
Is Nat on the board here?
He's not on the board here.
No, but
his daughter, Jenny, is.
Yeah, Jenny's there.
But I undoubtedly, Nat knew.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he actually knew some of these guys, and the first meeting, in Pulaski, there used to be a plaque outside the brick office where the first meeting had, and the plaque at some point got turned around, so you couldn't read it anymore. But that was the law office of Thomas Jones, and Thomas Jones was a cousin of Nat's wife.
Yeah. So they most certainly do know these people, and they know the actions that are taking place, despite the fact that we have no real evidence that they themselves are a part of the Klan. Again, like I said before, they're in this house, and they certainly know what's going on.
I think a name I want everybody to remember, if you're interested in this piece of history, is a guy named Frank McCord. Frank McCord was the editor of a newspaper in Pulaski, and within weeks of that franchise law where black men could vote, McCord started running a disinformation campaign out of his own newspaper, saying, essentially, we're hearing reports of masked men, we're hearing reports of, nighttime activities, but there's no proof of any of this. And what's amazing is McCord's directly connected to the Klan, but after a while they couldn't cover it up, and a Nashville paper started to cover some of what was unfolding. And this is when I knew that McCord was really up to something. He published an editorial, and he called the editor in Nashville an old granny. And he said he should come to Giles County and try to take the mask off one of these alleged Klan members and find out who we really are. I mean, that is in an era where there wasn't like that direct confrontation often in writing, that was a straight up challenge. Like, why don't you come down here?
Yeah.
Why don't you come down here and find out what's going on? And they weren't targeting just blacks. They were targeting whites. They were targeting people like Henry. They were targeting anybody that didn't fit the mold. But what do you think the ultimate goal was? What have you learned? Well,
I would definitely say that their ultimate goal was to definitely intimidate people. Like, right. I think I said this before, but it was definitely just to make sure that people stayed in the exact same spot that they had been in prior to slavery.
Right.
They weren't necessarily attacking sharecroppers, but they were attacking people that were trying to better themselves, going to Freeman's Bureau schools, attempting to cast their rights to vote.
Learning to read and write.
Yeah, exactly.
How terrible, right?
I know. How awful of these people to do something like that. Okay. And then also to try to teach these people how to learn how to read and write. So that's definitely something that they also didn't like very much.
So the one name we haven't mentioned, who always gets connected to the Klan,
I know who this is
Nathan Bedford Forrest. So that everybody knows this, Nathan Bedford Forrest did not create the Ku Klux Klan. Mm-hmm. That's no defense, but Forrest didn't create it. However, I think it's actually worse than that. Why did Forrest get involved?
Well, I would say that he got involved because he was from Tennessee. He was from the area. And he had also lost the right to vote like everybody else.
And you're hitting all the points.
And he was also a slave owner beforehand and a slave trader. And
you're hitting them all except one thing. And...
he was also a Confederate general.
That's a good one. You got one more.
Going.
One more. You're getting close now. One more. Because he was Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Okay.
The guy had he had a brand.
Yeah.
He had a brand. Everybody knew him, black and white. And the Klan, which was really had morphed into a lot of these what they call dens. So there are a lot of local groups. Mm. And they needed somebody who could serve as the face of an organization because, see, what Forrest could do was to provide an air of legitimacy.
Yeah, that's definitely a part of it.
And the person that Forrest probably hated as much as any human being was the governor of the state of Tennessee.
Oh, yeah.
And so Forrest gets involved at some point in probably 1968. His artillery chief talked about a meeting that was had in Nashville. Forrest was there. And Brownlow, the governor, resigned in early 1969 to become a U.S. senator. Mm-hmm. And it's incredible. The Klan activity stops almost immediately. So an old story that I heard was that Forrest disbanded the Klan because it got too violent. And it is true that because the Klan was a secret organization, it's not like they kept meeting minutes, right? There weren't subcommittees of the Ku Klux Klan that were actually having like board meetings. But there is Stanley Horn, who's a great author from years ago, found what's believed to be the only published order from that, and it is actually the disbanding, but it wasn't a permanent one. The order simply said to stand down until further needed. And at that point, the Klan, as it existed in that time, not just in Tennessee, because Forrest later gets hauled in front of a congressional committee, and he actually testified that there were, I believe, 40,000 Klan members in Tennessee and 500,000 in the South.
Yeah.
But of course, he denied any existence of the organization, that he was in the organization, but he knew a good bit about it. So what happens, going forward, what happens in the years after the Klan goes away? What happens in the South before the end of Reconstruction? Because, it's another 5 or 6 years before the end of Reconstruction. So what's going on around here?
Well, I would say that things are kind of going back to the way that they had been before. They, of course, would not need the KKK. They don't need the KKK until, 1920s-ish, where African-American people are starting to get more rights. And, of course, the Birth of a Nation comes out as well, which is, of course, another big deal. But that's a conversation for an entirely another
day. And why
day.
Didn't they need the Klan in the 1870s, let's say?
Well, because African-American people were doing the same thing that they had been doing even before the American Civil War. Now they're sharecroppers. They were being paid very, very little, but they were being paid, and no longer was Brownlow a threat, especially in Tennessee. And they didn't really see these people as, I guess, equals. They had achieved their job. They had honestly won.
They had achieved, they'd achieved their objective. They had certainly, General George Henry Thomas filed a report in 1868, and he essentially predicted the future. He said the people who'd lost the war were already rewriting the history of it, and would be seen as the virtuous victors in the long run. But I think what happened in the 1870s, I've learned this, at the end of, so Grant is president, Johnson's president when the Klan starts, but then Grant comes in and Congress passes enforcement acts, which is another reason on a national level the Klan gets clamped down. But at the end of Grant's term, his second term, as he's about to leave office, he made note of the kind of unbridled violence that was still happening in many southern states. And he actually pointed out South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And what I've learned is that for the sort of white resistance, they didn't need to wear a hood. They could be right out in the open. And they actually had support. And the few areas where black men were terribly resistant, and this is a story, I don't even think I've told this to you because I found this out as I was writing. There was a man in Mississippi, he was a state legislator named James G. Patterson, they call it Jim Patterson. He'd been elected in 1874 or 75. He was lynched. The killers were fingered by name. They had ridden out of Yazoo City in Yazoo County, and they flushed Patterson out of a hiding place. They hanged him from a pecan tree. Nobody was ever arrested. Nobody was ever charged. And Jim Patterson paid for being an elected official with his life. And that wasn't the only case, because the next year, Simon Coker, who was a state legislator, black state legislator in South Carolina, was grabbed in broad daylight by a white mob, shoved down on his knees and shot in the head and executed. Nothing ever happened. And then when you talk about the Klan of the early 20th century, by the time that comes around, Jim Crow's in place. So the secondary Klan becomes this very sort of anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jew. I mean, it was sort of early white nationalism, modern white nationalism. And then, of course, there's a Klan that, pops up again in the 50s and the 60s. And, of course, what are they doing but directly resisting desegregation and the civil rights movement? I think the thing that this is a heavy subject. A lot of people are like, why can't you talk about the fun stuff? Let's talk about Pat Claiborne and, Stonewall Jackson. I think that this period of time, I guess I've always known this and I've really come to believe this, and I see you, the way you're already talking to guests about it. People need to know this. They need to know what really happened, because this gives us such a much better sense of why we still struggle with this part of our history. Because frankly, we have just ignored it and told lies about it and covered it up. And I don't think I don't think Nat Chairs was in it. I don't think that any of but they knew about it. And I think you've heard me talk about apathy. When Henry Eddy and school children were being targeted by the Ku Klux Klan, when enough people will sit around and not stand up to do what's right, terrible things happen. And the Klan feeds on that, just feeds on that anger and that avarice and that that apathy. And that's what happens again in the 1920s, and it happens again in the 1960s. And, maybe I think once and for all the Klan probably is dead, but its legacy still lingers there on the edges. So
yeah, I would say that's the legacy of the Klan is definitely still around. You have your groups. It's certainly not 50,000 in Tennessee, 500,000 in the entirety of the southern United States. But the thing is, despite the fact that 500,000 people were in the KKK right after the Civil War, that's something that is not brought up in school systems at all. At least very little.
I was just thinking, if there were 5 million white people in the South and half of them were women, and I'm going to assume most of the women weren't in the Klan, and then half of the, there's a substantial part of the group that are children. So you got 2.5 million, and you take out the kids, maybe you've got like 1.5 million white dudes that could be in the Klan. Mm-hmm. And half a million of them are in it.
Yeah.
That means the Klan's literally everywhere. Mm-hmm. It's the guy it's the sheriff, it's the teacher, it's the merchant, and that's when statistics become, because why? And who said there were half? Forrest said it.
Yeah.
And he had no reason to lie about it.
Well, yeah. Why would he lie? There's not really a. Why would he do that?
He just said he wasn't in it, but he knew.
Yeah, he said. Yeah, he just happened to know a whole lot about the KKK.
The last thing, and this is also part of reckoning with the past. And I did a lot of this, not just with Forrest, but with all these guys that I knew who actually were in it.
Yeah.
And you know what I came to not a conclusion, but I was asking myself, why wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Of course they would do this. Because that's who they were. And that's the moment when you kind of, as a historian or a writer, you sit back and you're like, not everybody was like that. But these people were.
Yeah.
And recognizing that element was in society and it manifests itself like that is really... Well, it's troubling, and it's why you have to be resistant against, if you see something that is wrong, call it out.
Yeah.
Because if you just stand by and turn away or ignore it or don't report it or don't say it, when you know it's wrong, that's the kind of stuff that allowed the Klan to just gain huge support.
Traction that it did. But I do have to say that I'm very optimistic for the future, because whenever I do bring this kind of stuff on tour, people, it kind of stops them in their tracks for a second, because, oh my gosh, we're at a historic site where they talk about the Civil War, but I don't know very many historic sites that are around this area that talk about this time period that decide to bring up the KKK or even Reconstruction after the tour is like kind of weaning to an end. And it kind of does stop people in their tracks, like, oh my gosh.
I agree.
And the thing is, that's something that some people have the most questions about. It is the KKK, how it was founded, why it was founded in the United States, because it's something that's not covered all that often. In Reconstruction, you get 2 days in school. Yeah, you talk about it for 2 days. You might bring a grant a little bit.
Reconstruction isn't really sexy, but it's really important.
Yeah, these people are living in Reconstruction longer than they are living through the American Civil War.
Well, states like Tennessee passing laws to give black men the right to vote, 3 constitutional amendments, the first Civil Rights Act, the real bona fide Civil Rights Act of 1875. Those are watershed positive moments. And I agree with you. I'm very, very happy about how guests now receive this information, because I can assure you and anybody listening, 20 years ago, they didn't. But there's a whole new generation or two of people who are visiting historic sites, and you're right, they want to know, and they don't want this romantic nonsense thrown at them. They want to know. And that doesn't mean that they're looking to, call anyone names. I look at Nathan Bedford Forrest and I'm like, of course he did. It's a continuation of everything you said. Slave owner, slave trader, Confederate general, white guy. rich white guy, well-known white guy who's not happy about the fact that he doesn't have what he used to have.
Yeah.
Of course he would do it.
Mm-hmm.
And we shouldn't be surprised. So we just have to learn more about it. Any last words?
I don't think so. I
Young
think
person,
that's it.
young person working at a historic site. So once again, as we hear about how young people hate history and they don't care about history and they don't understand, you should come take a tour because chances are at Rippavilla, Carnton, and Carter House, you won't get me, but you'll get a young person who'll teach you a little bit about the past. So anything else?
I think that's it.
All right, thanks everybody.
Yep.